As part of our lecture series, recently we had included our alumni, and we had our first lecture series by alumni on archival research. So the last lecture series was on archival research, and now this is our fourth lecture series as part of our online lecture series by Center for Comparative Literature. And today we have our own distinguished guest, Professor Ali Ahmed. And Professor Ali Ahmed is going to talk on in the Cauldron text disciplines and the reading self. And we are absolutely privileged to have Professor Ali Ahmed. I request Professor Soumya, Head Center for Comparative Literature, to introduce Professor Ali Ahmed. Professor Soumya, can you please unmute?
Hello, can you hear?
Okay, sorry. Yeah. Thank you, Vamshi, and thank you everyone for being here. Those of you who joined a few minutes ago would know that we've had an association with Professor, at least I have had an association with Professor Ali and his colleagues in Queen's College. It has been an absolute pleasure to be associated with Queen's College and my colleagues there in the last in the year that I was there, which was roughly around 10 months. Thank you, Ali, for agreeing to this talk, and thank you, Professor Christopher Wings and Professor Claire Carroll for being with us today. And I also thank Professor Ansari and Tahir, who have been coordinating this web series. It's very easy to look up on a person today online, right? I don't have to introduce Ali to you. You can just Google. But then I wish to let you know that Ali is a very, very generous, both academically and personally, a very generous and a warm person. He's been the former chair at the Comparative Literature at Queen's College, City University of New York, where he's currently a professor. He is also a poet. He's an essayist, scholar, novelist, and a short story writer. His works have been translated into several languages, and his books include The Invention of Somalia, Daybreak Is Near, Literature, Clans, and the Nation State in Somalia, Fear is a Cow, absolutely true for us at least, Diaspora Blues, The Road Less Traveled, and which is a co-edited volume. And there is When Donkeys Give Birth to Calves. And then there is a Somali novel, Gaso, Ganuun, Gasiin. I hope I'm saying it right, which is roughly translated as Kraal, Milk, and Sustenance. Ahmed also teaches courses in African, Middle Eastern, and European literature. His research interests include the novel genre in the Third World, Islamic literature, literature and politics, fiction across cultures, immigrant literature, greed in literature and film, madness and literature, the poetics and noetics of orature. What is not perhaps available on Google is that Ali considers Kerala his second home, right? So for all the Mallus out there, Ali has been visiting Kerala for long, and it's his second home. And of course, his part Hyderabadi. His children studied here, and I would consider him very much a Hyderabadi. Welcome, Ali, and we are so happy to have you with us today.
Thank you, Soumya, for that really generous and kind introduction. It's really true. Kerala is really, it has always been a home for me away from Mogadishu. My second home, really. And Hyderabad, I have so many connections, as Soumya mentioned. My two daughters went to school there. My nephew went to the university, in one of the universities in Hyderabad, and he's married to a Hyderabadi. And they are now in Mogadishu, of all places, you see. So thank you very much for that introduction. I must really say that the center here at University of Hyderabad, its fame and name precedes you guys. And I said in an earlier sort of message email to Soumya and Tahir that I had some trepidation is really coming to the center to give a lecture. There was that sort of genuine fear in me to come in front of you and deliver a lecture. That said, it is a pleasure really to be here. What I will do tonight, today, is first, as Soumya mentioned, the title is In the Cauldron, Texts, Disciplines, and the Reading Self. What I will do is I will unpack these terms first so that you will know where I'm coming from and we'll have a kind of a frame of reference. A cauldron for me, and in the language itself that we are speaking in, it's a large cooking pot. But it's that cooking pot, when I use the language, there is a place where Chinua Achebe, the late Nigerian writer, once said, you must be able to really make the English language carry the weight of your background, of your culture. And in the case of Cauldron then, back in Somalia and in many other places, wherever there was a feasting, and feasting in those places, it's always communal. It has that communal collective character. So Cauldron represents that communal contour of a community coming together, because after all, when you feed and you have to feed a large group of people, then you must really be using a cauldron, a large cooking pot. It has that communal, as I said. And in the sense, really, if you think of Vico, for example, Vico, Giambattista, that is, Vico talks about three institutions that are common to every society. And he mentions religion, he says, marriage, he says, burial, including cremations, and I will add also birth, in the sense of these things that communities come together to memorialize or to really celebrate. So the cauldron for me then has that communal character. But the cauldron, after all, the definition of the word in English also, it is a situation of seething unrest. It's when something foams as if boiling after all. What that means then is, after all, it's this large cooking pot, but at the same time, all the things that I'm going to talk about, texts, disciplines, and reading style, are all in the cauldron. They are in that sort of cauldron, but at the same time, sort of, and this is what I want us to remember, that the cauldron that I'm talking about here is not static, it's dialectic. After all, if we say foaming as if boiling after all, in which case, in the final analysis, really what we know, knowledge by its very nature, both as object and as epistemology, must really go through James. So that is cauldron. The next term in my title is texts. And text for me, really, I go back to the etymology of the word from the Latin texere, which literally means to weave. And to weave in that sense, the idea of people saying, for example, spin a yarn, telling stories, in which case the teller, after all, the writer and the reader, because you'll be extrapolating and reading into the text, and in the process you will be spinning, weaving your own interpretation. So that is text. Of course, later on, if anyone is really interested in, there is an essay of mine that's just coming out in January on photography. And there I talk about the photographic image as text also, but with a kind of, with a sort of a small difference. And we could revisit that later on if we are interested in. The second word is disciplines. And discipline, of course, it's a field of inquiry, it's a branch of learning, and after all, it's part of that capillary power that Foucault talks about in Discipline and Punish. It's a social mechanism sometimes of control. It's characterization, classifying, specializing. So in that sense then, for me, disciplines, the idea of, and I'll revisit this later on, is that we need to decompartmentalize disciplines, literally to decompartmentalize. The last phrase is the reading self. Reading for me is really a form of comprehension after all. That if I say I have read a book, I ask my students, for example, did you read? And if they say yes, and I say, did you really, have you read that book? Which literally means, did you understand it? In the sense of people using ham radio, for example. When they say, do you read me? Of course, they literally mean, do you understand me? But the reading self in the context of this talk is something that I borrow from all people, Paul Duman, where he says in the artistic world that he talks about in literature, all of this, the problem of the self, he says, is particularly delicate, he says. The question of the self appears in a bewildering network of often contradictory relationships among a plurality of subjects, unquote. Here, Duman describes 4 ways in which the self, after all, appears in literature. And these 4, I quote from him, the self that judges, the self that reads, the self that writes, and the self that reads itself, unquote. This is from Blindness and Insight. Of course, I am aware of the whole controversy that has always really surrounded Paul Duman, and if anyone is interested, we'll be talking about them later on. But my interest here is the self that reads. So that is the title, basically. In the Cauldron, texts, disciplines, and the reading self. Now, when we talk about texts, disciplines, and the reading self, as I said before, I believe that we should really decompartmentalize disciplines. And the way I do this in my classes is I go back to an African fable. That fable is the 3 blind men and the elephant. And the story goes that there were 3 blind men at one point who had a genuine encounter with an elephant. One of the blind men touched the elephant's ears. The second one touched the elephant's tusk. And the third fellow touched the elephant's body, the scaly part of the body. Now, they came together later on to compare and contrast. And that's how really I see knowledge after all, comparing and contrasting. So they came together, and the gentleman who touched the elephant's ears described the an elephant's ear. Of course, the other 2 jumped on his case. And they said, you never really had an encounter with an elephant. And they described, the second one described the tusk, and the third one described the elephant's body. Now, the question that I pose to my students is any one of these men telling a lie? And of course, they really had a genuine contact with an elephant. What's missing then is that sort of holistic interpretation of what an elephant is. And here is where I'm driving with this. I always really believed, and I do believe, that if you really want to understand the totality of a human being, you must really be able to use the best insights of all disciplines. The social sciences, the humanities, and the natural sciences. And now we live in a world where STEM has really taken precedence over all other sorts of disciplines. But it's really important to decompartmentalize disciplines and let disciplines read and intertextualize them. So that is where I am driving with the title, basically. Now, what I will do is, one, I will talk about Somali literature, especially the novel. And the sort of novels that I'm going to talk about are novels that are written in English or are translated into English and are about to come out soon. But before that, though, talking about the decompartmentalization of disciplines again, that the novel, in a way, is a new invention. It is not supposedly really part of Somali culture. What that means, though, is by the time it comes to Somalia, that novel that is, this genre, the Somalis have already been reading other novels, and it was really not that difficult for them to somehow contextualize this new genre. But that genre itself is really related to other sort of disciplines, in the sense that literature by its very nature, and comparative literature, especially comparative literature, it has its links to philosophy, to journalism, to politics, to history, etc., etc. And to demonstrate this, I start with a quote from Mikhail Bakhtin in the Dialogic Imagination, especially that essay in the book, which is really very important, Discourse in the Novel. And Bakhtin argues that there is a close affinity and interaction between the novel genre and rhetorical forms. He writes, the novel and artistic prose in general, he says, has the closest genetic family relationship to rhetorical forms. And throughout the entire development of the novel, its intimate interaction both peaceful and hostile, with the living rhetorical genres, journalistic, moral, philosophical, and others, has never ceased. This interaction was perhaps no less intense than was the novel's interaction with the artistic genres, epic, dramatic, lyric, unquote. So here then, generic interactions and relationships do not, however, imply that the novel, the genre that we call novel, loses its qualitative uniqueness and become one with those rhetorical discourses that Bakhtin is talking about. The Somali novel, at its inception, grappled with conceptual and practical categories that coterminously blossomed with the introduction of the genre. Self-agency, individual responsibility, historical consciousness, and requisite social and political transformation. Here I'll start with a novel that was written in Somali, but was later translated into English as Ignorance is the Enemy of Love. The Somali title was Aqoon Darro wa Unna'ab Ja'ayl, and the English title is Ignorance is the Enemy of Love. Ignorance is a historical novel. It's a story of true love recounted in fictionalized form with a clear objective: to exhort people to learn the new Somali alphabet. The Somali alphabet, by the way, was really introduced only in 1972. Before that, Somali had no, the language that is, had no alphabet. Now, in this book then, it's a realistic historical romance. So Ignorance investigates a historical event as it uses the Dervish wars as a framing arch. Eventually, here, and I'll give a summary of the novel. There is this, the protagonist is a man called Ali Mah. He is a member of the Dervish, and the Dervish were fighting against the British in those days. This is in the 19 to 1920s, thereabouts. So the protagonist is sent by the Sayyid, the leader of the Dervishes, to Aden to sort of spy on British movements in Aden. On his way back home, he meets a young woman called Aurala. They fall in love, sort of, and later on, they agree to marry. She goes home, and he goes to the Dervish headquarters. There he briefs the Sayyid and the Dervish command of British sort of troop movements, and they were really impressed with what with a mission sort of accomplished. And right there and then, the Sayyid gave him a young lady to marry. Remember, he had a promise after all. He made a promise to Aurala. Now, he's married, and Aurala sends a letter to him in which she says, remember our promise, but the protagonist is illiterate. He cannot really read. So what he does is, he takes the letter to his father-in-law, and he says, could you please read this for me? Of course, the father-in-law was really irate, and he says, I'm not going to read it for you. The protagonist, Alimah, sort of thinks then that perhaps his father-in-law he has poor eyesight, kind of, that he can't sort of really see. Eventually, he takes it to his brother-in-law, and the brother-in-law reads the letter for him, but admonishes him for his audacious ignorance. Thus, ignorance is not only an enemy of love, but the enemy of self-esteem, as it compromises one's dignity by revealing a lack in one's life. The narrative then, the narrative construction and chronotope and its meiotic imperative leave no space or room for any flaneur, as Alimah's predicament is reproduced as the requisite concrete prehistory, to borrow from Lukács. Now, here then we see the need for the author's contemporaries to attend literary classes. The learning process gains its impetus and relevance from the symbiotic relationship between the individual and the collective. The message and the objective of the narrative inaugurate the raison d'etre of the novelistic imperative. The individual self is the center of attention, in that it assumes self-agency. But now, that is the gist of the novel. In other words, here was a novel written at this particular moment. Yes, it's a novel after all, with all the characteristics of the genre, but at the same time, this was written to exhort young men and women in Somalia in 1972 and after to become literate, to really spare themselves from that sort of shame. Of course, here I just want to sort of really mention something that Brian Stock rightly argues. And he says, quote, literacy, he says, begins with the collective. The point of departure of reading is the individual. To speak of literacy is therefore to shift the discussion towards the societal. To speak of reading is to shift it towards the individual, unquote. Here I will revisit later on some of the things that Brian Stock is sort of really talking about. Now, this is ignorance is the enemy of love. I will go now to another novel. It was also written in Somali, but it's coming out in translation in 2021. And that novel is basically called Manafai. Manafai is the eponymous heroine of the book, of the novel, basically. It is a coming-of-age story, and the protagonist struggles against the parental and societal injunctions that link her anxiety and angst to the plight of other youngsters in similar predicament. The narrative interferes with familial practices that thwart the desires of those in love, and through this disruption makes a parallel attack on the edifices of the patriarchal state. Here, the writer brings the two institutions into juxtaposition while subtly staying above the fray. This is, the writer of Manafai is Muhammad Dahir Afrah, one of the leading really Somali intellectuals. And even though he's tried to stay above the fray, the novel really ran afoul with the government, as did his other novel. And Afrah later on had to flee, basically, and become a persona non grata. But the narrative here reveals the truth in Ileana Rodriguez's succinct observation. Quote, "It's obvious that the discussion of gender parallels the formation of the modern nation state," unquote. What Afrah's novel shows then is how language in the sense of Bakhtin and the psyche in the sense of Lacan are pertinent sites for ideological battles. It also reflects the intense labor of criticism that precedes transformational periods in a nation's history. In Man of Fire also, it's the first time that the Somali language novel tackles the issue of human trafficking. Yet the narrative limits the ability of the characters to live without moralizing their experiences or profession. Here, talking about these two novels that were written in Somali, I will go to and conclude it actually with a discussion of Nuruddin Farah's secrets. Nuruddin Farah, of course, is an important writer, African writer, world writer, and the preeminent Somali writer after all. But Farah also has connections to India. He did his undergraduate studies at Chandigarh University. And his books really relate in a way and talks about that sort of experience, his experience in India. And I'll conclude, as I said before, with Farah, especially with Farah, his secrets. But before that, let me say this. In his work, Farah reveals a deep understanding of Somali culture. And this comes through in his argument that Somali culture, he says, is metaphor-based. He correctly argues that Somali culture is not overtly proverb-based. It is possible that many Somalis, scholars or otherwise, did not really give much attention to this dichotomy. Proverb-based cultures give prominence to exemplary nuggets of knowledge, a kind of pedagogic knowledge that drives meaning from a precedent, a past still capable of framing the future. This does not, however, imply that proverbs are irrelevant in contemporary life, or that they do not impart metaphoric knowledge. Rather, proverbs employed as apodictic tools tend to give or be utilized as an ambiguous last word to discourse or discussion. A metaphor-based discourse, on the other hand, compels the individual to be aware of the ellipses that dot the landscape of any discourse. A metaphor is able to create connections where you least expect them. It also fosters discussion as it points to a multi-layered polysemous meanings. A metaphor-based culture allows a community to associate ideas and things that are not necessarily thought of along the same axis. But now, as I said before, I talk about secrets. And this is really a difficult book to sort of really talk about in the sense that there are certain things that Somalis, certain scholars, of course, Somalis objected to. The gory details, the sort of the bestiality that you find in the book. But what I found interesting, really, is that Secrets uses some popular culture, Somali popular culture, astrology, and pedagogic fables to interrogate inherent beliefs and misgivings in Somali culture. Here, I will concentrate on Secrets as a narrativization of a trauma to the consciousness by means of storytelling. The Secrets as oppressive and repressive tools give legitimacy to fear, to a fear motivated by a need to conceal something. What the characters in the novel endeavor to hide or deny expression to ultimately resurface and violently come home to roost. Erstwhile secrets flourish through gossip and rumor. And with the return of an important character in the book called Shalongo from abroad, they gain poignance and force Kalaman, the protagonist's family, to confront the swirling rumors head on. Pressing circumstances compel the characters to come to terms with the past. The disintegration of the social and political structures that purportedly gave them a semblance of cohesion, and the events and the eventual implosion of shared moral codes allows them to reflect on and in the process unearth an accursed past. The vocabulary, the syntax of their discussion of the past is not suffused with conventional war imagery. Rather, it's the grotesque residue of transgression on the human and animal body, the bizarre coupling of human and animal species, the macabre insinuations of forbidden love tristes, and the unforgivable violations embodied in the rape of Kalamani's mother, which cast aspersions on his beginning. Yes. Now, what they do then, they say, we have to come together and talk about this. The urgency of the need and desire to confront the past, in the case of this family then, in order to manumit the human potential to soar is explained in a fable from Baydawa, Farah's birthplace in southern Somalia. The fable deals with the process of what I call rundillah, or revelation of truth, a mechanism or contraption to which societies resort when they find themselves at a sticking point. The crisis compels citizens to hold labhar sessions in which they seriously rethink their quotidian lives and endeavor to find plausible exit strategies. The fable in question then deals with a stasis that hampers a family's endeavor to succeed. It's about the father, mother, son, and their shepherd, whose shenanigans lead to the family's inability to deal with life. Finally, the father suggests that they confront whatever it is that is causing the disconnect and discord, tearing them apart. At first, the rest of the family suspects a ruse on the part of a father intent on gaslighting the rest. After some discussion, they all agree to participate in the endeavor. The father speaks first. You see, that lizard, he says, it will come to life if we all speak the truth. Sensing that no one will volunteer to speak first, he again volunteers to have the first stab at it. You see, he says, I have a secret wish that my wife would die so that I'll be able to marry a young woman. It's a wish I have been entertaining for a long time, and one that hinders my being a good husband and father. The wife lets out a guffaw, and looking at her husband, frames her desire in a contrary wish. She says, I have been for some time hoping that you die so that I could marry a young man. Here, the son joins the fray by spelling out a simple wish. He says, I too have entertained the wish that you both would die soon, so I would inherit the wealth. The family's eyes now turn toward the shepherd, who has been a seat at the family gathering. One thing that you will find interesting really in this story is there is no daughter here, but the shepherd is given a seat. And his secret wish, he says, was, quote, that you all die and I'll be the sole owner of your livestock. At that moment, the lizard comes back to life, and presumably the family lives happily ever after. Truth does indeed set them free. Now, in secrets then, the family and their interlocutors agree to unburden themselves of what for all practical purposes could be called secrets in plain sight, since from the very first chapter of the novel, the reader is provided with innuendos concerning Kalamani's birth, for example. And these pan out later in the narrative. What the plot of Secrets and the Somali fable from Baydawa, Farih's birthplace, share is the simple fact that individuals, communities, and nations do not prosper without a real reckoning of their most hidden desires and traumas. In Secrets, Farah creates a narrative he knows to be inchoate. Yet he hopes that the end of the impending civil war would dovetail with his creative solution to the problem. It's important to bear in mind that both Secrets and the fable about a dysfunctional family impart their message through the Rashomon technique. Both demonstrate through multi-voiced narration the urgent need for a covenant, one that rethinks the foundations upon which stand familial, clan, and national identity. What's needed, they seem to intimate, are introjected in internalized feelings of family and clan, congealed subliminally in the consciousness of the desperate members of both institutions. Both narratives are philosophical, emotional, and axiomatic descriptions of a present and a hoped-for future society. And that is Secrets. And in a way, really, what I sort of really see is that both Secrets and the fable, if you think about it, they spearhead a new way of looking at the world. And that is what literature does, after all, for me. One literature for me is an entrance into other people's lives. But at the same time, also, literature really gives us an insight, yes, into our lives, into other people's lives, but it also points, literally provokes our imagination. And the way that I use and define imagination is it is the intersection between the what is and that which is to come. Imagination for me is that intersection between the what is and that which is to come. And literature for me then provokes that sort of imagination. Both secrets and the fable then spearhead a new way of looking at the world. The narratives refuse to accept an injunction couched in a Somali proverb. Abesso haku unto, afku umarona. May a puff adder strike you is not good for the mouth. The fear is predicated on a belief that the enunciation might inspire thought of some sincere action, sinister, I should say, sinister action. Breaking with the past is a requisite for averting danger. It will also allow citizens to speak their minds. Secrets and the fable create fictional mechanisms in which the slogan is speak woman, speak man, speak children, speak, O elephant of the savannah, above all, speak the truth. It's only then that Somali society, Farah seems to be saying, might find a way to deal with its traumatic past, the pastness of the foundational myth of Bu'ur Ba'ir, of the Yibr, of the caste groups in Somalia. Avoiding apocalyptic doom by looking toward the future, by announcing it before its advent, in the hope that such enunciation will preempt its arrival, is tantamount to creating, and I quote this from Christopher Wings, to creating, quote, a space that can only be reached through a reliving that disaster and fashioning from it a miraculous weapon against its latter-day perpetrators, unquote. Secrets then and the fable, and good writing really for me, must be read as a kind of that labhar that I talked about before, making a clean breast of it, as well as a shout of deterrence. These are the sort of novels that I wanted to sort of talk about. But as I said before, literature, after all, and especially comparative literature, it's not only about Somali literature. And I think what really becomes important in the sense of the three blind men and the elephant is for me to understand a text, I must really understand the culture, the traditions that really produced that text. In other words, and I'll give you an example here. I teach sometimes, in fact, I taught this semester ending, R.K. Narayan is the guide. And when I teach the guide, I ask the students to focus on the first paragraph. Here you have Raju coming out of prison, and he did not really want to go back to his town, and he goes to a small village, but he finds a dilapidated sort of temple, and he sits there contemplating on what his next move would really be. While he's there, a villager called Velan comes to see, on his way home, sees this gentleman with his beard, and he looks at him Raju says, "What's the matter with you? Why are you looking at me? Sit if you want." And you could sort of really see, and Narayan uses an important word where he says, Velan is looking at Raju reverentially. This is a man he hasn't seen before. My students almost always sort of really say, Velan is someone who is really gullible. And I say, no, he's not really gullible. He's reading Raju. But reading by its very nature, as I said before, is really contextualized in the sense of you do not read things as though you were a blank space. You do not really read. What does that mean? What it really means is you're not a blank slate, but a parchment on whose body and spirits are infused with cultural symbols, with deeds, practical deeds begotten from cultural and material inscriptions on the reader himself. And I tell them he's not gullible. And if you knew something about Dharma, in Indian culture, in Hinduism, Dharma, moksha, karma, then you sort of really see why he is looking at him reverentially. Because most Swamijis sometimes, they sort of, when they give up, like ascetics, they go to dilapidated sort of temples. And that is what informs Velani's reading of Raju. And in that sense, then, it really becomes important for me to really know something about Indian culture, about Indian history, about the socio-political, economic symbols, because after all, literature is based on reading symbols and symbolisms. I think I should probably, Soumya, stop here. How much time is left for me? Because I really want this to become a dialogue, a conversation.
You could end in 5 to 10 minutes, Ali.
Okay. So that reading, all to bring these together then, let me sort of revisit again that in that cauldron that I talked about, we have all these novels, we have the reading self. In a way, really, the title, come to think of it, it sort of really reminds me of Edward Said's book, The World, the Text, and the Critic, sort of. All of these really put together in that communal pot. But it's not static after all. And that's the beauty of literature for me. It's dialogic in the sense that there are always that possibility that it will ignite our imagination. And as I said before, that imagination for me is the intersection between the what is and that which is to come, in the sense that it's a horizon after all. And a horizon is by their very nature. You are always in pursuit. You are really running after them. And once you come to where you think the earth meets, the sky meets the earth, then it recedes. So for that reason, for me, comparative literature especially is a kind of what Goethe called the Weltliteratur. It's the mother of disciplines, really. Yes, philosophy could be the mother of disciplines, but the interconnections between literature, especially comparative literature, to philosophy, to other disciplines. And for that reason, I always really advocate. I exhort people, and my students especially, to decompartmentalize disciplines. That in the final analysis, if I want to read a human being, as I said before, I must really know something about biology. If I want to understand, because after all, it's not only human bodily sort of functions that could explain what a human is. I should know something about economics, the social sciences. I should know something about the humanities. And in a way, really, literature does things that other sort of disciplines could not really do. That ability, as I said before, to enter into other people's lives. I stop here, and as I said before, really, it's a pleasure, really pleasure, to give this talk. And at the same time, it is, for me, really all sort of knowledge by its very nature is dialogic. And I hope we'll have a good, robust sort of discussion. Thank you.
Very much, Professor Ali, for such a passionate and informing talk. I request Professor Ansari to initiate the discussion.
Thank you, Professor. I'm MT Ansari. I'm also from Kerala, incidentally. Yeah.
Goodness.
So my job is to moderate the discussion. I already requested for comments, questions, etc. in the chat. So while that happens, since Christopher Wing's name was evoked, probably he would want to come in.
Yeah.
You want me to come in?
Professor Wings.
Yes. Just about your metaphor of the cauldron, since I work on the Caribbean, I'm also thinking of the Nganga, or the Cazuela,
yes,
which the devotees of the Congo spiritual practice called Palo Mayombe use, and all kinds of materials, from feathers to bones to objects that carry a power, are all put in there. And the name Nganga is also given to the one who works it, So I think that that's another addition to what the cauldron can do, because the idea is it can work magic, what's called magic. It can operate transformation. And secondly, the quote about reading being an individual practice, whereas literacy is collective. I wanted to nuance this a little bit, because in the tobacco factories in Cuba and also in Tampa, Florida, where there was a large Cuban community in the 19th century, there would be a reader while people rolled cigars, and the reader would be reading from poetry, from the works of, say, Jose Marti or Antonio Maceo, and that was the collective practice, but with an individual reader. So, that's that kind of, complicates the matter a little bit, I think. So I just wanted to make those two comments.
Chris, no, you are right. First, in terms of, when we say the cauldron, the magician is sort of cauldron that you are talking about. In a way, I sort of didn't really want to raise that part of the cauldron, you see. I was interested in the sort of the other things that I was talking about, but you are really right. In the case of the quote, that's why I said I have some kind of misgivings. And you are really right. For example, you will remember your old professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o's book Matigari, where Ngugi wa Thiong'o from Kenya wrote a novel called Matigari in Kikuyu. And what happened basically was that most people could not sort of really read. They were illiterate in a way. But what they will do is they will ask someone who's literate, who could read, and he will be reading to them. So in that sense, it's not really an individual sort of activity. It becomes an individual activity in the sense of when we talk about the emergence of the novel in England, for example, in the sense that when people came to the influx of people, of course, as you all know, the rise of the novel, and supposedly, and I'm not really saying that it is only in England that it first emerged. There is Don Quixote and etc., etc., etc. But the emergence as we know it after the Industrial Revolution, the assumption really was that there were certain factors that contributed to the development of the novel. And these were the influx of people from the rural areas and coming to urban centers. And to the idea of the printing presses that could now publish books en masse, for example, and with people in urban centers, the emergence and the burgeoning of a middle class that could buy books. And of course, it was different in the sense that before, for example, if we were in a particular village, we will always have someone, a grandmother, a grandfather, someone who would tell us stories around that sort of evening fire. But once you come to town, the scheduling even will be different in the sense that there will be people who will be working in strange shifts after all. And they had money. So you could buy a book, and the idea of reading as an individual act then sort of comes from that tradition, that you will take your book, sit somewhere, and you sort of really read. But that's what I was saying. Even there, it's not an individual act, because you're talking about the deeds in the sense of practices and belief systems that come from cultural and material inscriptions, and those inscriptions are inscribed in the reader. So yes, that is what Brian Stock was saying. And that's why I said I will revisit it later on. But I agree with you, Chris. The examples that you gave, Matigari, for example, and other sort of examples, I totally agree with you. But thank you.
Yeah, please, Claire Carol.
Thank you. I just wanted to thank you, Ali. I learned so much as always, and I found a kind of impassioned call to a return to theory and its intersection with history and literature that I found very inspiring. You know, we can't give up that meditation on theory and what it teaches us. And I really loved what you had to say about Bhakti and demand. I have a specific question about Secrets, which is a novel I love. And we had an email correspondence about it over the summer, but it's about the ending of the novel and the outbreak of the civil war in Somalia, which appears there at the end of the novel. And I wondered if you could comment on that in relationship to what you said about how the novel, and it's not all novels, but I think really these conscious revolutionary novels of the kind that Farah writes that mediate the relationship between the individual, the family, and the collective. Like, so what is this? The family secret is revealed, and at the same moment, this civil war is breaking out. And could you comment on that?
That's really a very important question, Claire. And it is really, see, the secrets, they're oppressive by their very nature. And early on, the family, the Kalimani's family, for example, they're trying to somehow, he will ask his grandfather, no. And he'll say, why did you name me? Why did you give me this name, for example, Kalaman? And the grandfather says, no, I wanted you to be different after all. But through the grapevine, he hears a lot of other things. And in a way, really what you find is the civil war at that moment, the civil war, unshackles the spirit. And shackles in the sense of, if you sort of really go back, a literature that you know better than I, Italian literature, that you sort of really see after the Second World War, people literally came together in the sense that publication is multiplied after all. There were printing presses after all over Italy. And it was because that sort of freedom that people wanted to talk to each other, talk about that past. And what you find then, wars, yes, they're horrible. They are really, the devastation is they wrought on societies and nations. It's really true. But at the same time, also, they unshackle. In a way, they create a space for people in which they could now sort of really talk literally about their lives, about what needs to be done. So in a way, the civil war that Farah literally presages, in a way, it's that civil war that allows the family to really come to the table and discuss. In much the same way, though, that the fable itself, because once a society reaches at a sticking point, you cannot really wiggle your way out unless you literally confront the issues. And civil wars allow you, force you, compel you to really confront the issues if you want to get out of that sort of sticking sort of place. I hope that makes sense, Claire. But in terms of, and I agree with you, in terms of theory, I think it's really important. Theory, as you know, the etymology is thea, no? In Greek, which literally means to see, And what it means is there is a group of an ethnic group in Tanzania. And when they tell stories, they ask the performer, the storyteller, and they say, see, so that we may see. See to the performer, to the storyteller, so that we may see. And the interesting thing here for me really is, it's that seeing, after all, is an act of interpretation. And yet, it's not an individual act, even though it is, because you see with your own eyes. But what they are saying is, we trust you. See, so that we may see. We trust you. So theory, by its very nature, for me then, it is really important to also in a way, analyze the sort of sources of theory for us to say, see so that we may see. It really becomes important to have that element of trust to a certain extent. But theory, again, in a way, it does not gloss over differences. What it does is it sort of creates this framework. And in a way, to me, theory, the way I see it, is really if you were going to a supermarket, kind of, where you have all the ingredients there, and much really depends on how you are going to concoct these sort of things later on and put them in a cauldron. And what comes out of that concoction, in a way, my concoction would be different than someone else's. But there must be something that goes back to the store again, from where the ingredients came from. And for me, that is really theory. It's a way to see. Thank you, Claire.
Yeah, Professor Ali, probably because of the rich detail in your talk is inhibiting people from asking questions. Probably they are still digesting what was said. While we wait for questions, I thought I could ask. It is not a question, actually.
Yeah.
It is more rather a request, couched as a question. It is a request for information. In the sense that you have been talking about decompartmentalizing disciplines, which in a way I would put it as decontextualizing and recontextualizing disciplines.
Yes.
Yeah. So in that context, I was really curious that the modern Somali literature probably started around 1970s, which is quite late. So what were the historical conditions which sort of happened? If I'm correct.
Yes, sir.
That is very late because in Kerala we have novels in 1880s. So 1970s modern literature, modern Somali literature seems to have started from around 1970s. I mean, I'm sure there's a language issue, etc. So could you just talk a little bit informative?
Right.
Yeah.
True, Professor Ansari, but we are talking about written literature after 1972. Literature has always been there in all societies after all. And in fact, the interesting thing here is the etymology of the word, for example, for literature in Somali, the word is Sugan, S-U-U-G-A-N, Sugan. And the etymology for that word really is, it refers to certain plants. And those plants are plants that do not really die when there is drought. But this is literature, Sugan, especially a plant called Gasiin, for example. And what the Somalis sort of really, their understanding that is of literature is like the sap, the liquid of that plant that never really dies, that people and animals will always really be at its mercy, even when there is a calamity, a drought, and a famine, that is. So in that sense then, literature for them is not only something that nourishes the body, it nourishes the mind, it's something that nourishes the body. So literature has always really been there. In Somalia, for example, you will come across poetic duels in the 19th century, late 18th century, for example. But what was missing was the sort of alphabet that was, the orthography, that is. But even before that, in the 1900s, 19, for example, 1910, 19, or 1890 even, there were sheikhs, the priestess, who were writing their poetry in Somali, but in an Arabic alphabet. So they were writing them. but these were really, of course, the literate, the sheikhs, etc., etc. So in that sense, what literature, and that's what I meant by when I tried to connect Nuruddin Farah's Secrets, a novel that I say, as I said before, is really, it's an amazing novel. It's an amazing novel. Talk about whatever that means, postmodernism, the fragmentations, and the sort of ruptures in human consciousness. And yet, that novel has connections with a fable in Somali. And therein you sort of really see that, yes, they feed off each other after all, that the literature was always there, but it is in its written form that the military government, the revolutionary government, Supreme Revolutionary Council, mandated that Somali will be written from then on, they said, in Latin script. So it's only 1972, if we are talking about written literature in that sort of Latin, in the Latin script, but the literature always, of course, predates.
What was the resistance to the introduction of Latin script? Was there any resistance, or it was widely accepted?
There was, yes, you are right. Because the mere fact that you will say Latin, there were groups of people who interpreted Latin, instead of the T, they said Ladin. Latin, if you take the T, Latin, and you say Ladin, it literally means in Arabic, no religion. And they were really smart, the opponents of this script, that they tried to somehow exhort people to rise up against the orthography, because it was an orthography that had no basis, no kind of connections to Islam. And they say it's Latin. So there was really. But what happened in a way was, here we had a military government. And the military doesn't mince words, as you know. There is no constitution. There is no sort of really referendum, etc., etc. There is nothing that sort of really says, what would you like to have? What would you like to see? What they did basically was they said Latin. But there was also that kind of practical sort of side to it. The typewriters, etc., etc., etc. That said, though, there are certain sounds in Somali, like in Arabic, that are not found in the Latin script, in the sense of ha, for example, or if you pronounce my name Ali, it's ah, it's ah, or ha, for example, etc., etc. Even though there is another language in the riverine areas that's called Mai, and it doesn't really have ha or ah. So the military were able to force their way. And I honestly think sometimes the only kind of misgiving that I have sometimes is when it comes to the other language in the riverine areas, where people rightly believe, and rightly so, I think, that their language was not really taken into account. But other than that, I think it was the right decision to make, really.
Yeah, but this is generally accepted now, or the imposition of Latin?
Oh, no, it's right from the get-go. Once the military said, this is the script, no one could really say anything about it.
Sir, can I? Are you able to see the chat? There is a question in the chat window. Should I read it out?
No.
The question is from Leia. Leia, do you want to ask the question yourself? Leia, are you coming in?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, okay. So, Mr. Ali, you had a very interesting discourse, which was rich with information. So, the beginning of your long speech, you mentioned that the Somalians had their script alphabet introduced at a very late stage in the late 1900s. So, I'm curious if they did not have any written text in the in this language before, or if they did have to somehow represent their language in a written form, how did they do it? And
Yes.
yeah.
Yes, thank you, Laia. Yes, as I was saying before, they will write in the Arabic script, for example. They are writing Somali, but they are using Arabic script. That's what they used it, what they did. There were other Somalis though, before even the revolution, before the military government, that is, who also came up with their own sort of scripts in different forms. They were mostly sort of, they were all really using that Latin script that I'm talking about, but in different sort of shades. There was also a very important script that was called Osmania. Talk about not the University of Somalia, but it was called Osmania, named after its inventor. And that was a new invention, really. It had nothing to do with the Latin script. It had nothing to do with Arabic. And it was an ingenious way on the part of Osman Kennedy, the inventor, to have come up with that. But then again, all these scripts were really put aside by the government, and it was the Latin script that was accepted and taken as the Somali sort of script.
Thank you, sir. But I also have another doubt, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Then, if they did use the Latin and the Arabic script before the introduction of the Somali script, their native Somali script, and the Somalians had certain sounds that they couldn't represent in the Arabic or the Latin script, how did they do it then?
Yes, they invented their own. For example, my name, Ali, as I said before, in Latin, you sort of read that A-L-I. But in Somali, it is C, because the C for us is A. So it becomes C-A-L-I.
Okay.
You see what I'm saying, Laia?
Yes.
So it's Ali. The Ain is C,
okay.
in our case. There is Ha, for example.
Yes.
If you say Haji or Hajj, it's X in our case.
Okay.
So they somehow really, there are about 2 or 3 or 4.
Okay, I see. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Professor Ali, there is a question from Hassan, which is also a request to speak a little more about the Arabic script history of Somali literature. The Arabic script history of Somali literature.
That takes us a lot longer. Just give me a second. I wrote a whole sort of article on this a long time ago, and oops, sorry. I wrote an article a while back called "The Arab Factor in Somali Culture." And the Somalis, as you all know, really, we claim to be Arabs whenever it suits us. We claim. And there I was sort of really arguing. Let me read, just read parts of this. Somali literature in Arabic. This section is, I want really, it says much Somali experiential wisdom is kept in the bardic memory. The preponderance of poetic forms was perhaps necessitated by an inclement pastoral environment compounded by the absence until 1972 of an agreed upon orthography for Somali. Yet written poetry has always existed in that the Somali clergy either wrote their poetry in Arabic or wrote in Somali using Arabic alphabet. In this case, the dominance of poetry does not imply or mean a complete absence of prose works. What it does point to is the paucity of written prose work and the need for more archival and on-the-ground research. Now, there is a number of Somali religious prose narratives written in Arabic, and the narratives are called manaqib, written by disciple sheikhs who rhapsodize about the accomplishments, mystic virtues, and majestic feats and exploits of their immediate or putative mentors. There is, for the person who asked the question, there's a good article actually written by Alawi Ali Aden, a Somali, called A General Review of Somali Arabic Literature. And that article identifies 3 foundational narratives that exemplify the thrust, reach, and scope of this literature. According to Aden, Sheikh Abdullahi bin Muallim Yusuf al-Qutb, this book, Kitab Nasr al-Mu'minin, book on the victory of the believers, has earned its author the sobriquet of, quote, faqih, mufassir, and adib, jurist, exegete, and man of letters, that is. And there is, you have Sheikh Qasim al-Barawi, you have, there is Sheikh Muhyiddin, I mean Sheikh Abdul Rahman bin Sheikh Umar Ali, you have Sheikh Uwais al-Ghadriya, and all these wrote in Arabic after all. It's a long, if the writer is interested in, if the questioner that is, you could share them with my contact, this email and that sort of thing, and I'll send them this article called The Arab Factor in Somali Culture.
The question was actually from Bashir. He was having some problem renaming. So it is from Bashir, and I request Bashir to get in touch with Tahir, who will share the contact information of Professor Ali, and we can have a communication, personal email or whatever directly.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Chair, how are you timed?
Yeah.
Hold on. Bashir, are you trying to speak? Bashir, go ahead if you...
No, nothing. It's okay, fine. I will talk to Tahir.
Okay.
Since doesn't seem to be any further questions, I should take this opportunity to
Excuse me.
thank. Yeah, sure.
I'm so sorry for interrupting you. I just had another question.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, so Mr. Ali, you said that the Somalis use the Arabic and Latin script. So, because the script is pretty much connected to the language and the culture of the region, uh, did it also pave a way to the assimilation of the Latin and Arabic culture into the Somaliland and the Somali culture?
I agree with that's really a very important question in the sense that after all the language that you speak it is one that it encompasses your worldview and controls to a certain extent, at least shapes and informs. Yes, they did in the sense that after all the part of Somalia, the south, which predominated to a certain extent in terms of the erstwhile Somali states in a way, was colonized by the Italians. And in a way, of course, there were people who were well versed in Italian literature, as I was saying before. But in a nutshell, they were able to somehow domesticate it.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Sure.
So it's just some of the features of the Arabic and Latin culture that was adopted by the Somalis and domesticated it, and so it grew into a culture of their own.
But remember, though, we're not talking about Latin culture. We're talking about Latin script. But the interesting thing about Somalis, in a way, and so many other societies all over the world, really, is we are utilitarian at times. What we do is we take whatever is useful from other societies. And in this instance, what was borrowed basically was only the script and not the world view, if you will, or the sort of mentality that comes with the script.
Okay, I see. Thanks a lot again.
Sure.
Since there doesn't seem to be any further questions, let me take this opportunity to thank the Tahir and also CCL students for suggesting names to be people to be invited from a wide spectrum, and I hope that will continue. And with that, I hand over back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ansari, for initiating the discussion. I again take this opportunity to thank Professor Ali. I request Tahir to propose vote of thanks.
Hi, dear Professor Ali Jimale Ahmed. It was indeed a great pleasure to have you as our fourth speaker in this lecture series. And indeed, it was great also to know about your Kerala links. I didn't know about that until Soumya revealed it. And at least two of our own scholars are working on Arabic Malayalam, which is somewhat similar to what you have been talking about. Yeah. So definitely they will get in touch with you, I think. I don't know whether they are already in touch with you. Also, I take this opportunity to thank you for your wonderful and passionate lecture which you gave. I would also like to thank Professor Christopher Wings and Clary Carroll, who joined us for this talk. I would like to thank Dr. Vamshi, who chaired this lecture. I would like to thank Professor M.T. Ansari, who handled the Q&A session. I would like to thank Professor Soumya Dechama, who suggested to to invite you for this lecture and also to coordinate this thing. I would also like to thank Karthik and Lohita from CDLTR who are giving us the Zoom platform. Last but not the least, I would like to thank all the participants who joined us in this evening for this wonderful event. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dair. It was a pleasure, really. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ali.
Thank you, Soumya.
Yes, we hope we'll get to see each other often.
Soon.
Yes.
Sometimes, yes.
Yes, often and soon. Yes.
Soon.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks, everyone. Chris and Claire, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ali.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, everybody.